All right, today I'm joined with Hans von Walter, Dr. Hans von Walter. I'm Dr. Puder, and today we are going to go through an analysis of the recent film Joker. And I would like to say that as a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist, something that really gripped me with this movie was the depiction of human suffering, of Arthur, the main character's suffering. And I had a mixture of nausea, disgust, sorrow, and pleasure. I think I left the movie with a slight headache. In the best way possible, right?
Yeah.
And maybe I think our discussion, in our discussion, I really want to go through the mental health aspects of this movie, the depiction of mental health. We'll go through the different diagnostic criteria. We'll also talk about mass shooters, talk about the narratives, talk about why it's so controversial, why people either love it or hate it.
Yeah.
So just starting out, what were some of your general sort of, this is how I felt watching it and how I felt leaving?
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for inviting me to the podcast, Dr. Puder. It is truly just an honor to be nominated. I also want to commend you on properly calling this movie by its correct title, which is Joker, not The Joker. I have seen that mistake in many places, and it's annoyed me to no end as a true cinephile. But for me personally, as a psychiatrist going through this film, I think I was just gripped in my seat by what I felt was a almost like horrifyingly, like distortedly accurate kind of depiction of what I imagine a good amount of like my patients have to go through. And it was, because it's so often the experience that we are privy to is the one where we see either in the office, in the clinic, or on the inpatient unit. And so to see this kind of visualization of what happens when beyond those doors, it was a little chilling. I think chilling was the word that I came away from it.
Yeah, everything from the music itself, like I'm pretty sure if I just played that soundtrack for like a full day, like I would feel like in a very sort of disturbed, perturbed mood. Like it was dissonant. And then I watched like a 30-minute sort of like tutorial on the lighting and how they use lighting to depict kind of the loneliness or the disgust or the sort of the dreariness of it all.
There was like a harsh kind of fluorescence throughout the film, a lot of kind of, halogen office type lighting, hardly any like actual like just natural sunlight. Like when he's outside, it's almost like it's covered, Gotham is depicted as a very, kind of city in disarray. So with that, comes like this kind of air of like pollution. When he's visiting the Gotham, the Wayne Manor, it's like cloudy overhead. Like there's almost no depiction of just any sort of like just natural sunlight, except I want to say in the big pivotal scene when he is going down the stairs. I think that's when things take a little bit of a different turn for him, and that scene has now become very
iconic.
Very iconic, yeah.
Yeah, and I think for those of you who haven't seen this, there are going to be some big spoiler, like basically all the spoilers. And I would also say, like,
Batman's parents die.
This is don't say that. No, I'm joking. I would also say that we're going to be giving our opinions, but we're also going to be talking about science and talking about what's known about psychiatry and what isn't known, and hopefully teaching as well about mental health in this. So
let's dive into it.
Yeah. One other thought that I had about just the overall ambience was there is no skylines.
Yeah.
So, and I watched the director talk about the making of it, and he specifically took out any skylines. So he added in like industrial stuff in the background to take away any skylines, to make you feel like you were kind of caged in.
Yeah, very claustrophobic. I think that's another good word that kind of describes the environment of the film.
Yeah, one of my friends said, if a movie makes you feel something good or bad, if it makes you feel something, either good or bad, it's done its job. It's not about whether you like it or not. It's about if it worked to make you suspend disbelief that the person or those people were actually going through that thing.
Yeah.
Right. And I think Joaquin Phoenix, am I saying that right? I know you. Okay.
Es correcto.
Joaquin Phoenix's Joker did that. He was incredible. Like, I think he'll get an Emmy. Is that the right word?
Oscar.
He'll get an Oscar.
Emmys are for television.
Oh, man.
Oscars are for the movies.
Yeah. So do you want to get an Oscar or an Emmy? Is that your life goal?
Why not both?
Okay. One thing you may not know about Hans is he won Jeopardy. Is it?
That is correct.
That is correct. Okay.
I was on College Jeopardy back in my college days. And actually, we're coming up on 10 years ago that happened. So good times.
Yeah. And, this is the top profitable comic book movie of all time at this point. And when I was reading, and we'll talk about this later, is that some people are not watching this just one time, not just two times. Some people are literally going to the theaters like 10 times. Yeah. And I'll read some of the quotes that I found from real people.
That's crazy.
I think that the most interesting part of this film to me is the empathy they were able to generate in the audience.
Yeah.
Okay. So perhaps the start of the empathy was when they showed a character who we want justice for, right? Some sort of growth, some sort of transformation. He also demonstrates empathy. Although odd, his kindness to his mother, getting her mail, giving her a bath, which was...
Yeah. It
was odd.
Yeah, but it's a flip side of like a desire for empathy that starts to become a little bit almost pathologic, I think.
Well, it's almost like he was childlike in it.
Yeah,
like he was, and he came across as childlike to me.
Yeah.
He seemed to show kindness to the children that he interacted with. Right? Like he authentically wanted to make them smile. He wanted to make them laugh. And we feel empathy for his coworker, right?
Yeah.
The little clown that was getting laughed at.
Yeah. No, I think what was evident just in all his scenes, like with his coworkers, was definitely like he was finding peace in that camaraderie. And so I think later on when that kind of breaks down, that has a rather like, they've specifically set up those scenes of him, interacting like with his coworkers and whatnot, so that a couple of scenes later on would be a lot more impactful for kind of the twist or turn of events that he has to go through, like basically almost like, betraying an empathy that kind of he was like searching for in the first place.
Right. Even this like empathy that they sort of start to build in you towards him and his character, I think it continues even as he starts to do some of the killings.
Right.
So, after, for example, after the first killing, it seems like self-defense, and we'll get to that in a second. But the second thing is that he demonstrated a deep desire for empathy and connection, and something as the audience member, I felt a desire to give him.
Yeah.
So he's looking for empathy, right? So he says the worst part of having mental illness is people expect you to behave as if you don't.
Yeah, that's a quote that I've seen getting shared in a lot of different places, and I think that like if this film had a thesis, that one would be the closest that we would have, to exhibiting one.
And I see this in all domains, like even on the interview trail. Sometimes there's stigma against the applicants who have mental illness as
Yep.
they go into psychiatry
Yep.
to treat mental illness.
Yep.
I see it in churches, like how we treat people who have mental illness in the church, leaders or not
Right.
leaders.
Yeah. Even in my own, in my own experience of like, I come from a Latino background, and so mental health can be a little bit more stigmatized in that culture. And so I think even in I think I remember telling like my mom about mental health. It was more so that she was like happy about the aspect of like, oh, you're going to be like a pastor, and not so much the like, oh, you're going to be like giving medications or shocking people.
Yeah. I think that there's a much lower percentage in the Hispanic community. I was recently looking at like the metadata across the US, and it's like, I think it's about a third of what the, white people, Caucasian people seek out, like 3 times more than Hispanic people.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So, there were these parts of him that needed empathy, right? At the same time, there were parts of his like moral decision-making, which at the end of the day were his choice.
Yeah.
And so it's like this fine line in this movie between this is his mental health issue and these are his like choices that he's making.
Yeah. And I've seen that a lot, in particular when it comes to, just, a lot of times, when we are faced with an action that someone has done, we as human beings have a tendency to want to immediately try to rationalize it. Like we try to look for a rational explanation. And sometimes I think the false easiest thing to go to is like, well, they have a mental illness. And it's a distinct, I think it makes it like easier to like come up with that explanation rather than face the, like you said, the probably like moral conundrum of like, this person did have a choice, whether it's like someone who like wrongs you or what ends up happening to Arthur later on in the movie.
Yeah. And I would say that only 5% of violent acts are committed by people with mental illness. So if you have mental illness, it's actually more likely you're going to be a victim of violence than a perpetrator of violence. And that is a huge, like even when I talk to people who are well educated, but they don't have any training in mental health, they tend to think that people with mental illness are more frightening, more scary, more violent. And I think it's really good to set the record straight that there's a difference between mental illness and violence.
Yeah, no, I think that that's one of our biggest responsibilities as psychiatrists is to be able to firmly like set that record straight as far as the fact that a lot of our patients suffer, like they suffer greatly, so to see oftentimes what I think is like a depiction in some forms of media where oftentimes like a person with mental illness is the perpetrator of a crime, that makes it very difficult to be able to like have a good conversation about this.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, here's a moment where I felt some empathy towards him. His boss asks him why he lost the sign, and he said, "Didn't you hear? I got mugged." And here's an authority figure who he wanted to be understood by, right? And believe the worst about him, right? And it's this moment where you're just like, oh, you don't see him.
Yeah.
You don't see him. I wanted to jump in the scene and defend him.
Yep.
Well, there's a scene where he was with the social worker and he said, "No one hears me. You never even listen. Do you even listen?" His therapist responded, "You're on 6 medications. They have to be doing something."
Yeah, and my couple of the other co-residents that I went to go watch this with, we did have a vigorous conversation about what those 6 medications possibly were. So we have a few theories.
Okay.
But it's like to see that everywhere that he was churning, he was getting no like moral support. and that was his perception. And actually, like this all being his perception, I think like plays a bigger role later on when we talk about what could have possibly been a hallucination, a delusion. We talk a lot about in mental health, with certain, let's say, personality disorders, that a lot of times it's like a distortion, or personality disorders or psychotic disorders, or, that it's a distortion of perception, and sometimes a distortion of reality. And so that's one thing that, especially like, in like DBT type training, and therapy, we try to educate people on how something they might be perceiving may be coming from like a different perspective. So seeing that consistent, feels like no one is hearing me, feels like no one is supporting me, understanding me. I think that is an interesting aspect to, what we later see happen to him.
Right. So sometimes in someone who's has more personality structure, they could have been empathized and heard and understood for 20 sessions. Mm-hmm. But the one session where they don't feel heard and understood, they'll say something like, you never hear me, you never understand me, you just don't get me. Mm-hmm. And it's really speaking to as well, like the developmental trauma that's there, where they didn't feel heard, they didn't feel seen, they didn't feel understood. So it's hard to differentiate in a movie this short what was what. Like, did she really connect with them other times? Or every time was she just repetitive and redundant and unhelpful? He also told the man he thought he was his father, Wayne, that he just wanted a little warmth. So there's this scene in the bathroom, and he confronts Wayne like, "You're my father," and it's like he was yearning for that sort of embrace, and instead he gets a punch to his nose.
Right.
Or from the talk show host, instead of like being told like, you're awesome, like I would love to have a son like you, he gets ridiculed for his medical condition. So he desires this hug, and he gets the opposite, right? And in this fantasy with his neighbor in the hospital scene, he gets a back rub. So once again, like all of his like desires and yearnings are for connection.
Right. I love that you point out, especially about the back rub, because it's such a subtle directing choice to like tell the actress like, just give him a little back rub, like that, because it didn't have to be in there, but it added that extra little element of like, that's a visual cue for the audience of this is a connection that's being made, or that you think is being made, that he's desiring, that he's longing for.
Yeah. So then we move into like the murders, right? So the first two murders seem to be in self-defense. Right. He's getting beat up by three guys, and he pulls out his gun and he shoots two of them. And then, it even pulls you in where you're kind of like, these guys are like people you do not like.
Yeah.
Right? They're being sexually provocative to a young girl on the bus. They're being totally inappropriate. You just want to like, you want to stand up. You want justice.
Yeah.
You're right. And so we feel this reaction of like a little bit of like justice.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of like, I'm trying to pull in like how they tried to pull you into this movie so far with empathy that you continue to align with him, right?
Yeah, you root a little bit for him to defend himself, however which way possible, even though it ends in in these guys being dead. What I think is interesting, kind of about where the movie goes from here, is this is ostensibly a city that's very corrupt, very crime laden. So the idea that like a couple of like self-defense kind of murders on a subway would make like such a big impression like across the press of the city and that kind of thing, that was one of the, like, for me, elements of the story where it made me wonder, like, is this another element of, almost like an idea of reference, like for the Joker, for Arthur to think that like he's making a bigger impression, or he's making his actions are larger than maybe like what they might actually seem. Like for all we know, like, we the movie establishes pretty firmly later on that Arthur is an unreliable narrator. So for all we know, this could have been just like a little blurb in like one of the like one of the page 6 of the Gotham Times or whatever, rather than big front page like
Right.
a couple of douchebags get murdered on the train.
Yeah, I think for the sake of our analysis, I think it's interesting to look at, like, we don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know. And that's what makes this so much fun, like analytically, right?
Yeah.
Is like, we don't quite know. So he kills the third guy, which is interesting. He chases the third guy to kill him.
Yeah.
Right. And then he ends up in a bathroom and it's dreary and it's dark, and he kind of does like, does he do a dance there, or he moves his body? It's kind of,
is that what? Yeah, that's the scene where he's like contorting himself, and he's got like the gun, and yeah.
And then after the heartbreaking discovery that he was abused as a child, right? So he finds out, movies don't have the same HIPAA protections that we do. So he goes to the psych hospital and he grabs this chart from his mother, and he finds out that his mother's been lying to him and that she really suffers from delusions and that he was horribly abused. And it's interesting. I heard this before I went to the movie, and I was expecting to see a lot of visuals of the abuse, and I was expecting to be like jarred by those visuals.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people who are in the lay public, like, they don't come up against like imagining those visuals on almost a weekly or daily basis like we do, like in our field.
Yeah.
But it still was very, very difficult. It's always difficult.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the classic kind of horror movie moves. You think back to like the scariest thing is the unseen. So you think back to like Jaws, like the whole movie, Jaws is like terrifying, like this town, but all you see is a little fin, but then your mind just like fills in like with the imagination of like what could possibly be lurking under the water. Same thing with this, like they didn't have to show the abuse, but just the way that it affected him, like your mind just starts like filling in all these like horrible like what if scenarios of what could possibly happen to him, and in many ways that's almost like more horrifying to one as a viewer than just maybe actually like seeing a depiction of it. Not that I was like hoping to see a depiction of it, but
right. Right.
No, I just thought that was an interesting. Yeah, I agree that was a very deliberate choice to not show anything from like his past, not even like an implication or anything like that.
Yeah, and I heard some parents were taking their like really young kids, like 8, 9-year-olds. I'm like, please do not do that.
Well, that's just ridiculous.
That's like, I was exposed to some of this content at that age, and I wish I was never exposed to it.
That's disappointing.
So someone, and then he goes on to kill his mother.
Yeah.
Right. And his mother had a stroke. And so, interestingly, when I was like reading through tons of articles and Reddit and stuff like that, someone said, well, I actually think like it was altruistic for him to do that. Like he was doing it out of a good place.
Yeah.
But it just showed how some of the people who have watched this, kind of like are once again like empathizing or joining the hero. Right.
Well, and it's also that like rationalization aspect that I mentioned earlier. Like they're trying to look for like, a reason, like why, like beyond just like this person just did an act.
Right. Right. Yeah.
This person made a choice to like commit this action.
And then he kills Randall, his former clown coworker, who lied to him about, or lied to his boss about him potentially, potentially got him fired, and also kind of bullied him. It kind of seemed like it was kind of like he made fun of him a lot, but he didn't kill the small clown because the small clown, it seemed, had shown him compassion. What do you think?
I think that was one scene that for me, just as a moviegoer, bordered a little bit on that was a little bit, I felt, exploitative to me. Like I felt viscerally uncomfortable.
Okay, tell me more about that.
I think for me it was, I think one element that it was trying to dial into was like, first of all, the horror that he's like trying to, that he's kind of torturing this poor little person. And then when he's trying to like jump up and like unlock the door, and that was the part for me where I was just like, I don't feel like this was necessary, like to bring home the point that this scene was already showing, that Arthur was undergoing a transformation, and like of kind of like ego and of mind. So that was one part where I was just like, this wasn't necessary to bring home the point that this scene was already conveying.
Okay.
Yeah.
You felt bad for that.
Yeah.
Guy.
Yeah.
For the smaller clown. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm glad he survived.
I'm actually like, I would have been really upset if he would have been killed.
Yeah.
I would have been really upset. And then Murray Franklin was finally killed after he was, attempting to humiliate him on television.
It's interesting. When this film was greenlit, it was basically greenlit under the conceit of like what if a comic book movie was made like a Martin Scorsese movie? And so the closest, and like that's how the studio like funded the film was being like, okay, we're going for like kind of a different aesthetic, like the other kind of DC universe movies.
You're gonna have to break that down, like who that other guy is and what movies he's made.
Martin Scorsese. Okay, so he's done Taxi Driver.
Okay.
He's done Gangs of New York. He's done Raging Bull. He's done did Wolf of Wall Street, The Aviator. So he's famous for very kind of lengthy character-driven narratives that like you're basically witnessing an on-screen transformation.
Okay.
And so the closest analog to this movie is Taxi Driver, which also stars Robert De Niro in the Arthur Fleckish kind of role as he kind of like descends into this, in that movie, he's more blatantly kind of like a psychopathic madman, or a sociopathic madman, which we'll talk about it a little bit. So his choice, like, to be cast in this particular role, I felt was kind of an homage to that.
So overall, like as the movie progresses, we kind of blur our idea of traditional right and wrong.
Yeah.
And we enter into his mind and his reasons for his murderous rage.
Right.
And that's interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting to have that experience. It's kind of like, it kind of reminds me of The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Oh, wow.
Do you remember that book? Classic English literature. English, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. And
Oscar Wilde.
Basically, in The Picture of Dorian Gray, this guy starts to do progressively more and more evil things. Mm-hmm. And as he does it, the painting changes and gets more evil, but his face stays childlike.
Right.
And when it came out, there was this huge upheaval about it.
Yeah.
Like people did not like that this book existed, period.
Yeah.
Right. But people have said, like, look, no, this book accurately is portraying the progression of something.
Yeah.
Of evil in particular for The Picture of Dorian Gray. And because of its accuracy, it's stood the test of time as a good literary work. And I think this is going to be a cult classic.
I think so too. It's definitely made its impact pretty solidly at this point.
So let's go into, first of all, his medical condition. Okay. So Joker had a laughing disease.
Yeah. Pretty prominent. Yeah.
It's pseudobulbar affect. And these are uncontrollable episodes of crying and laughing. Sometimes they come spontaneously with patients, but for him, it came with emotional content. In the US alone, 1.5 to 2 million people have this. So some people who have it, like, they just don't go out as much.
It's pretty debilitating. I've seen a couple of patients with it, and it's the word that gets used a lot is emotional incontinence, just like an uncontrollable, like, or sometimes rapidly random, just spurts of emotion.
Yep.
So in some cases that might manifest as laughter. For some people that might be tears. It's pretty debilitating and difficult.
Yeah. And so for him, like, there was this like deep sadness and agony underneath, but it also matched his loneliness to some degree and his feelings of like disconnection from reality. So for example, disconnection from connection with real people.
Right.
So he's on the bus, he humors the child, the mother turns around and kind of gives him like, stay away. And then he breaks out in this like laughter. And it's like, he's also got this like agony of like, no, I was like connecting with this kid. I was making him happy.
Yeah.
So I've seen multiple clients from this. I run a program at Loma Linda for people with medical and psychiatric issues called MEND. And we've had people who come into the program, and it's really good to be in a group over time, over longitudinal, because people they see it and they have compassion for you. And usually it's from a traumatic brain injury.
Yep.
And so the patients that I've had have had huge amounts of stigma from this. And it's been like a daily sort of burden that they carry, that people just don't get it.
Yeah. There is actually another movie that's out right now called Parasite. It's a Korean film that's kind of gaining quite a following. And there's another depiction of pseudobulbar affect, like someone undergoes a traumatic brain injury and ends up having kind of uncontrollable fits of laughter. I won't say anything more because it would spoil the movie, but you should check it out. It's interesting that pseudobulbar affect is having its moment in the media spotlight.
The second medical condition that we know he had was a traumatic brain injury.
Right.
So he had a card that he informs people about his pseudobulbar affect, and on the card it said he had a history of a traumatic brain injury. And I would say the other symptoms that he has that kind of connect with the traumatic brain injury are his like childlike intelligence. So I really think like the Joker is not the Joker we see in subsequent Batman films.
Right.
Like you can't all of a sudden become
a mastermind,
hugely like Machiavellian.
Yeah.
And like very sort of like 10 steps ahead of everyone else. Right. He's a little bit disorganized. He has simple language to describe things. He, his sketchbook is very chaotic, even on meds. And he, and I've also seen with traumatic brain injuries, unfortunately, I mean, this is like really traumatic, but people can be more depressed chronically, more irritable.
PTSD is a huge problem.
Yeah, PTSD and traumatic brain injury are really linked, especially in the military. Concussions, multiple concussion syndrome in football players. And it's if he had enough damage from the TBI to cause a pseudobulbar affect, he's probably got damage in other areas of the brain.
Yeah, because that's a very deep-seated injury if someone does have pseudobulbar affect, because those structures are kind of deeply embedded in the brain. So there's a lot of other things on the way to that area that are also very important in one's kind of neurological functioning.
Yeah. So now let's move to the psychiatric issues, and we'll go through different diagnoses that he could have. Diagnosis. And I had one person who emailed me, it's not diagnoses.
Well, that's the other reason why you brought me onto this show.
What's the word again? Once again, it's good to remember that mental health issues do not cause violence more than the general population, right? And I'll put the citation on the blog to kind of support that.
Good.
So how did Joker's childhood trauma influence his behavior? So thinking sort of pre-diagnostic criteria, right? So we know that, childhood trauma and continued trauma was something he experienced throughout his life.
And the psychological impact of that, especially on a child, is, it's immeasurable, honestly. During that time in a child's life, there's so much pruning and imprinting that's going on in the brain. Like within, I think something like between the ages of like 5 and 10, the brain grows a certain number of size in comparison to what it was before. And so for something as traumatic as the abuse that he suffered to happen repeatedly to him when he was that young, that's the kind of thing that ends up just sticking with a lot of people who end up having to go through that.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I've known people who have had mothers who are like schizophrenic or psychotic or untreated, and the amount of like therapy and treatment that they need, it's like years of treatment, but they do come out of it. And so when I watch this, I'm also thinking like, gosh, I wish he had like a good day treatment program. That would make so much of a difference.
Right.
Oh, okay. So, and in the midst of that trauma, he continues to have this odd relationship with his mother, right? So one example is he's giving her a bath. He's co-authoring her narratives. By that, I mean, he's checking her letters. He believes her delusions. And I've seen that in some people who have grown up in traumatic families. They almost sort of side with the aggressor, the aggressor being the person that abuses them or allows them to be abused. And so they side with the aggressor and they continue to sort of support the aggressor.
Right.
He was neglected. He was physically abused. He, instead of being angry, it was most adaptive to him early on to join with her, to nurture her, to be her caretaker.
In some ways, that helps alleviate the constant traumatic blow of being in such a abusive relationship. I mean, we see that classically in so many people who are with abusive domestic partners, men and women who. It's just a lot of times just easier to go along with it, rather than take whatever stand it is when and in a situation like this, like where he's already starting with a pretty kind of, shall we say, poor deck of cards. He's not going to have like the ego wherewithal to be able to make a conscious decision like that, to break away from his aggressor, especially if he himself is someone who, he needs, presumably at one point she was helping take care of him as he aged into adulthood and whatnot.
Although he is the one that's serving her and her needs, at least in the parts that we've seen.
Right.
It's some form of longitudinal connection that he has. Outside of that, like, who does he have?
Yeah.
So as a therapist, I wouldn't be immediate to want to cut out that relationship, right?
Yes.
Because I would want to help him have some boundaries and help him move into more adulthood and hopefully maintain the relationship. So boundaries would keep him in relationship with his mother. But, unfortunately, we never got to see that sort of thing happen. So it's interesting also because I also think sometimes when people carry that anger and they turn it on themselves, like he's chronically depressed. Right. So he's angry about the injustices and the things that have been done to him, but he turns it on himself. He blames himself. And there's a point in the film where he kind of turns that anger outwards and it's a murderous rage.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you pointed that out because so much of, I think, the discussion about this movie's kind of mental health element has focused on, the psychosis and the delusions, but that element of depression that is like consistently chronic and present throughout the entire film. I think that plays as much, if not a bigger role, feeding into this than some of the more colorful symptoms or aspects of the film.
I think people who are incredibly lonely resonate with this film because of his depiction of depression.
Yep.
He says things like, all I have are negative thoughts.
Right.
All I have are negative thoughts. The worst part of having a mental illness is people expect you to behave as if you don't. He has this chronic depression. It's always there. He's never happy.
Yeah. You even see it in his when he, I would arguably say that when I see him the most happy in the film, even before kind of the climax at the end, is when he is performing for the kids. Even then there's still just kind of a background, kind of a baseline level of despair. And I think the word they use here, dysthymia, I think is a perfect description of that, because it's basically just like that kind of baseline level of just like a functional depression in a sense. And that's where he had been living for, looks like, probably the majority of his adult life until the events of the film.
And I will add that people who are depressed, if they can make other people happy, if they can make other people laugh, they feel that. They feel that. Our brains light up in the way of other people's brains through mirror neurons and stuff. And so when we make other people grateful, we feel grateful. When we make other people feel happy, we feel happy. And so he's in this, so it's an example of his empathy as well. I think people without any affective empathy, without the ability to feel other people's feelings, they don't care. They treat other people like insects. They treat other people like they're they're nothings. So he had the depression, he had the poor interest, poor sleep, irrational guilt, low energy, poor concentration sometimes, kind of like his disorganized thought process, decreased appetite.
He was emaciated.
He had to lose. This poor actor wanted to be a little bit heavier, on the heavier side, but the director said, no, you must lose weight. So he lost 50 pounds.
Well, and the funny thing is, I think there were several points in the movie where you can tell that Joaquin Phoenix is a fairly fit guy, and I think you can tell at a few points that this is someone who used to be fit, who lost a lot of weight in a rapid amount of time. So I just thought that was interesting.
Did he have high functioning Asperger's, or high functioning autism? It's called autism spectrum disorder now. It used to be called Asperger's. Do you think he had autism?
I think that's an interesting conjecture.
Maybe define autism.
Okay, so autism is considered I feel like I'm being pimped.
Just a couple of the symptoms that you might see in someone with autism. So
someone with autism displays a kind of a chronic level of difficulty with interacting with others in a social situation. Particularly those kinds of things include picking up on social cues, this kind of idea of being able to read a room, and it's not just that it's in certain situations. It's just it's persistent. It's persistent at home. It's persistent when you go out. There's a certain sense of structure that those with autism really like. There's this idea of what this term is called stereotyped behaviors, being able to repeat a thing in order to there's a sense of calm that comes from being able to let's say line up certain belongings in order, or keeping things different from, I would say, an OCD type pathology, but still kind of in that same range. So all these things come together in someone who is more, I would say, inwardly focused, and it's a neurodevelopmental disorder that it can be very difficult to live with.
So could you say he had a narrow set of interests, being a clown,
right?
But here's why I think he probably wasn't autistic.
Right.
I think he actually
Convince me. Yeah.
Okay, so in autism, they lack cognitive empathy, but they have affective empathy. So affective empathy, the ability to feel other people's emotion. Like even my patients with autism that come in, they can feel when their parents are unhappy with them. They can feel when we're happy with them.
And as opposed to cognitive empathy, which is being able to pick up on what others are thinking, or that's essentially picking up on the social cue.
Picking up on the social cue.
Like if someone is trying to like silently like tell you something like with their eyes, like, hey, stop talking or something, like that's not the kind of thing that they're going to be able to like pick up.
Yeah. Which, I mean, he did lack some social sort of, he lacked the ability to read some social situations. But at the same time, I think he had a deep desire for social connection.
I agree.
And, sometimes you'll see the autistic kid playing in the corner with like some objects and, sort of uninterested in the human engagement. That being said, I've seen autistic kids who really do enjoy like coming to my sessions where they enjoy seeing me, they enjoy coming in, or like when they play, sometimes they do enjoy engagement, but it's like a different kind of like, they want to like play with an object and maybe you're playing with the object with them or something. Now further, people with Asperger's autism are not more violent than the general population. Yeah. So at the end of the day, I don't think he was autistic.
Yeah. I think there's, we have enough evidence that there were so many other kind of psychosocial factors at play in contributing to the person he was or ultimately became, that attributing it to a kind of inherent neurodevelopmental disorder such as autism is, I think, kind of discounts all of that other evidence.
Yeah. I bring that up because in some of the mass shootings, they'll say like, they'll throw around that word like, oh, he was autistic or oh, he was Asperger's. And I think it's good to, sometimes also people get misdiagnosed as autism. I'm not saying this is the case for him. If they're antisocial or psychopathic. Okay. What were the Joker's psychotic delusions is the next question. So the Joker had this desire to be important and to be connected to people, right? And so, for example, he has the fantasy of being on the show. And I would say this was a fantasy. I don't think at this point we were watching this as if he was really believing this was happening.
I agree. That was definitely depicted as a wishful, kind of like place that he went to to bring himself a little bit of joy. And because he was able to recognize that he wasn't actually there, which is, and the reason I agree with you is because it's in stark difference to, or contrast to, some of the later delusions that we do see are basically confirmed to be delusions, such as the entire relationship with the neighbor.
With the neighbor. Right. So in this show, he desires a fatherly hug. He's being told, I wish I had a son like you. And this was just such a glimpse. Fantasies can sometimes be a huge glimpse into the inner world of someone. And I would say I have a lot of patients actually who have lived heavily in fantasies. Like I had one patient who was spending like 3 to 4 hours a day in fantasies every day. And
they were able to recognize that it was a fantasy and not that they were actually living out some delusion.
Yeah. And they knew that it probably wasn't the best thing, but they just enjoyed it.
It's comforting.
It was comforting.
And it's a narrative that to some degree they have control over. Like,
it's adaptive.
Yes. Yeah.
It's adaptive. And so I think as a therapist, I approach that with curiosity, without shaming it, of course, and with trying to help them tell me the story.
Right.
And we'll look together at it and look at how it has been adaptive. And I'm not in the impression that they need to get rid of it right away.
No.
You know?
I agree. It's something that it's a potential like kind of unpolished tool or, diamond that you could potentially like sculpt and mold into something that could be very useful for the patient eventually on down the road. Like this idea of, the idea of like a coping skill of being able to like think of something happy or think of be in your happy place.
I don't know if I tell people to be in their happy place. For the record.
Sure.
For the record, no Happy Gilmore going on here.
All right, no Happy Gilmore.
But to see it as like people are on a journey, and the fantasies are telling you what you desire. They're giving you a glimpse of what you find meaningful. And so once we have that as professionals, then we can start to help them take small steps towards those things. And so sometimes it's very hard to get accurate representations of what someone truly desires. Yeah. And so I love fantasies and dreams for being able to do that. And then there was this woman, right, who there were a couple moments where I was like, I can't believe that just happened.
Yep.
Like he opens the door and he like kisses her, and I'm like, okay, I did not see that coming at all. Like, I didn't think he had the courage to do that or the social skills. Like, this is like throwing like a pretty big...
Yeah. Like, it's a wrench in like the character that you've come to know by that point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, like, obviously the scene in which we meet that character in the elevator, it's a relatively, innocuous... interaction, and they're like, it's what a long day it's been. And then she does like kind of just shoot me kind of, like gesture, like, and he really takes to that, like, and really just runs with it in such a, I think such a, I don't want to say adaptive, but like, it's empathy. Yeah.
It's empathy. He feels what she's feeling, and he feels that she's feeling exactly what he's feeling.
Yeah.
Like life is grim, life is burdensome, and here we are, two passerbys, or two people who are passing by, who can share that moment, right? Yeah. And then she's at the comedy club, and she's kind of smiling at him. She's supporting him, concerned about him at the hospital.
Yeah.
So we see this sort of nice moment of light.
Yeah.
And then it starts to kind of show us that maybe what he's seeing is not reality, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because the specific shot that I'm thinking of, when he ends up in her apartment and you see her be like, "Are you the guy from down the hallway, Arthur?" Right? That's the big reveal that this relationship wasn't really like meant to be. It was a very specific, I remember a very specific shot composition where he's in the foreground and she's in the background and she's very blurry. Like it's kind of like a diopter kind of shot. And so I think that parallels like this fuzzy kind of fantasy that he was viewing of her, that he has now transformed to like this whole thing, when in reality he doesn't know her. And that's what that shot was like trying to like demonstrate.
Yeah. It definitely it really like broke my heart. I know. I just wanted him to like
just get a nice back rub.
Just a little back rub while your mom just had a stroke, just like, that's like, can I get you some coffee?
I know.
One of my thoughts is like, just for the people who may be listening to this who don't have a history of treating schizophrenia or some sort of psychotic illness, is that usually you can stop the intensity of the auditory hallucinations within a couple days.
Yeah.
Like day one on an antipsychotic, right? The auditory hallucinations are already like getting like dimmed down.
Yeah.
The delusions may take months to go away completely. And so it's like if someone who was psychotic was faced with a woman who was like, wait, why are you doing? Can you get out? Like, he would only create further delusions to like make himself maybe feel better.
And I believe it is at that point that there is a correlation, I believe, around that point. That's when his medications start getting taken away.
I think that's around that
yeah.
time. So it's the question of like, how much did that play a role?
Right. Something that was maybe being kept at bay up until that point, at least from a biological standpoint or a pharmacological standpoint, was now slowly like the dam was cracking.
Yeah. One thing that I try to teach the residents when we look at someone who's in the midst of psychosis is how do we empathize, not with the psychosis of the delusion, but with the meaning underneath or the desire underneath. So to empathize for him, it would be like, of course you're entitled to desire connection with someone else, with someone, that makes sense. And of course you're entitled to desire fatherly admiration, connection. And it's, and that's a good desire. Yeah. So it's not like co-authoring the delusion.
Right.
Co-authoring the delusion would be like, yeah, that girl really likes you. I could see that relationship really working out. Yeah. You're agreeing with this delusion that he's having a relationship with his roommate.
Yeah. No, I think that even at my level of training, that's still very difficult because, the inclination when someone is kind of like active psychosis is, I don't know if I can penetrate this right now. I don't know if I can just penetrate what is very clearly a psychological, psychiatric barrier that otherwise I would be prescribing a medication for. But there's still that therapeutic alliance that can be set with someone who is in psychosis to be able to meet them at a place, almost like a neutral ground between like where they are in psychosis and where you are as a practitioner. There's like somewhere there's like a neutral parlay area.
Yeah.
So I'll get better at finding it.
So now that we've talked about the delusion, the question is, did he have schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder? And usually in schizophrenia, the most common auditory hallucination for men is something insulting or derogatory, like you're stupid or you're an idiot, or a common one that in the data is like you're gay or you're like so some of these sort of things that would be experienced as derogatory or bad beliefs is the most common symptom of schizophrenia. And it seemed like to him, most of his fantasies were very positive.
Right. Yes. And I think I've honestly seen that to be more of a manifestation of very kind of psychotic depression, where I'm thinking of especially a couple of adolescent patients where they retrieve into this more retreat into this more positive kind of auditory hallucination that they find comforting, that they find to be something that is good to them, like because oftentimes they're maybe escaping a trauma or trying to escape some sort of reality of the outside world, and so then this positive auditory hallucination ends up being very comforting for them. Yeah.
I like how you put that. So something that I've seen is in someone who, for example, who's homeless and they're living behind a dumpster, they may believe that they're Jesus or the Queen of England or some famous person as a way of sort of feeling powerful,
right?
Feeling that they are sort of important.
Right.
And it almost protects them from the reality of like, no, you're struggling, you're homeless.
Yep.
Like, so sometimes there is that sort of grandiose delusion that sort of keeps them and have their mind psychologically sound.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that for a lot of people, if that's a daily kind of like state of mind that they're living in, and it's just the way that what they use to survive, it's not inherently in and of itself something that like needs to just be immediately locked up. It's something that they have incorporated into their everyday life. and into their ability to be able to survive.
Yeah.
So yeah, let that guy think he's the king of England. Yeah. He's
Right.
the ruler of his dumpster domain.
Right. It's not helpful to counteract a delusion directly. If you've ever done that, you realize that very strongly.
Yeah.
The only thing that will come up is a stronger delusion.
Yep.
Okay, so the next thing is, and I'm not sure we really answered this question, by the way, and I'm okay with that.
I'm okay with that too. And I don't think the movie necessarily wants us to answer that question. But I think that in our role, especially as psychiatrists, I think this is a really helpful conversation to have because I have listened to one podcast in particular that has talked about this movie. And for the most part, it's the view of mental illness that I think that a lot of people think that this movie is perpetuating needs a little bit more nuance to be able to discuss, and honestly, it's a reflection of how oftentimes, like, even we have trouble with the diagnosis.
Right. Someone like this would show up to the psychiatric hospital. We'd get this history, and then the next 5 days would tell us a lot of information. Actually, how do they respond to medications? How are they sleeping on the psychiatric hospital unit? Are they sleeping only a couple hours a night? Are they sleeping through the night really easily? All these things change the way and that we make sense of things.
Right.
Okay, the next thing is, did he have bipolar disorder? And so, usually with bipolar, there's like this ramping up over days, weeks, right? And then you have decreased need for sleep. You have increased speech. That you're talking more. You are grandiose, so you feel like you're on a special mission, a special purpose. You have a flight of ideas. You're more impulsive. But really, the decreased sleep and the grandiosity are really the things. And I like to say it always ends in a psychiatric hospitalization, jail, or death.
Yep.
Because usually when you get amped up that high, it's just not coming down in a normal way.
Yeah, and what I like to teach my medical students is what I look for if I'm looking to diagnose bipolar disorder is I'm not looking for just the word mood swings. Like, if you come to me saying that someone's bipolar, like, and the only criteria you have is mood swings, then I'm gonna have you go back and get more history. What I distinguish as bipolar disorder, especially since the diagnosis involves either mania or hypomania, is distinct, sustained episodes of this elevated mood that you're talking about, where you're not sleeping. In fact, you like feel energized, like, from not sleeping. Like, you're up all night, like you're making plans. You're going on like almost like a high, like you got like an Energizer bunny in you. So oftentimes when if a patient comes to me saying, I have bipolar disorder, I think I'm bipolar disorder, and so I paint this picture for them of like, oh, okay, so you've had episodes where you've just been up all night, like, working on like, all these like great plans, and then you've gone out and spent like hundreds of thousands of dollars and blah blah blah, and they look at me like, no, actually, that's not me. So I have been one, especially like with my medical students, to be like, get the diagnosis right, because it is a very important diagnosis to make sure that you have correct.
Yeah. In his character, we did see some insomnia.
Yeah.
He, at one point, in sort of a really interesting way, he pulls out things from his fridge and he gets into his fridge and shuts the door.
Wow. I completely forgot about that. That was bizarre.
Yeah.
That was just weird.
Yeah. It was like, okay, what is going on?
Yeah.
What is he like? What's the thought process that leads to that?
The Joker did not have bipolar.
So in summary, we don't think he was bipolar at this point. Okay. Okay. So next we move on to forensic diagnostic stuff, like non-psychiatric, like this is not the stuff that normally psychiatrists treat.
Right.
So
you think we treat it?
Well, what do you mean?
Sometimes people think we treat it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Incorrectly.
Incorrectly.
If someone's like got these sort of forensic diagnoses, because they can be seen as, existing, they think therefore psychiatrists are responsible for them.
Right. Antisocial personality disorder is in the DSM.
Right.
But unfortunately, it falls into this category of forensic diagnoses that are very difficult to treat or control over the course of someone's lifetime.
The only time that I ever see someone with this diagnosis is when they want something from me, like Xanax or opiates. Yeah. And once they realize that I'm not going to give that to them, then they move on pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So, okay, was the Joker a psychopath? So let me define psychopathy. A lack of affiliative attachments. So they don't like bond to people normally.
Yeah.
And they lack empathy and they lack fear. Okay, they have a calculated predatory aggression, which means that they have strategic planning that leads to violence. Afterwards, they're remorseless and they demonstrate callousness. They demonstrate a callous disregard for the rights and welfare of others.
Now, my question for you is, so, and I know, as I'm sure you'll define sociopathy in a little bit, but the fact that psychopathy is named as such, is there an element of psychosis that's evident there that like maybe a psychiatrist could treat?
No. So psychopathy, and this definition is from like there's something called the psychopathy checklist.
Nice.
And this is thought to be around 2% of the male population, 1% of the female population.
Ooh, that's a lot higher than I would.
There's an article by Cummings, my mentor.
1 in every 50 people. That's crazy.
And it's thought to be, some environmental factors are there, but it's largely genetic. And so there's a really good article, I'll link in the blog, going through the genetics and the brain changes and all of that stuff. And, depending on like their environmental stuff and their choices, they either kind of go one or two ways. One is like the classic, like sociopath, violent criminal, right? Antisocial personality disorder, where they become like a hitman or a hitman or a drug lord or a pimp or something where it's like they're doing nefarious things and hurting other people and they're really just trying to benefit themselves.
Right.
The other is the prosocial. So interestingly, in psychopathy, because it's more of a brain state, where they lack fear, they lack the attachments, they lack the empathy. They can do jobs where you don't need that stuff as much. Actually, you would benefit from not having those things. Like if you are a bomb diffuser, not having fear would be a really good thing.
Right.
Certain military jobs, certain test pilots, not having those types of responses is a good thing. So, my thought on this for him is that he actually showed empathy, which makes me think he was not a psychopath.
Right.
He did show no remorse after killing, and he actually made the comment like, "I thought I would care more." That was a little bit
flirted with it.
Yeah. That was a little bit more traditional psychopath statement.
Right. But I think my counterpoint to that would be of, I think back to some of my like schizophrenic or schizoaffective patients that have difficulty with with empathy in the first place. And so when something happens to them that they're not used to, like, schizophrenic accidentally, I think those first two, or in self-defense, like killing someone, that would be kind of, that's an odd happening to them. Like, and so it's such a difficult thing to like process as a thing that is happening to you. I'm probably not explaining this correctly, but
here's what a forensic psychiatrist said once. He said, if someone who's pleading like not guilty for reason of insanity, tried to hide his tracks, that person would be more likely a psychopath. If the person is found standing over the person that they just killed and saying, "I've killed the devil," and that person would be more likely to be like the schizophrenic or the psychotic.
Yeah. And I think the final shot of him standing,
the psychotic schizophrenic, I just want to clarify.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the final shot of him standing on a taxi cab while chaos is reigning around him. I think it's that second psychotic element of, like, this is a thing that's happening because I was a victim, or not necessarily one. I do not think that in that moment his thought process is, finally I have made the world burn. Like, finally, this is the final step of my master plan. I do not think that is what is going through his head at that point in that final shot.
He's not Machiavellian. He's like childlike in a lot of the stuff that he's doing.
Yeah.
So the other thing is, usually psychopaths have a long history of predatory aggression. So for example, for Ted Bundy, like at camp as a kid, he was creating deer traps where he was like trying to catch potentially people in these things. Right. So there's a long history of predatory aggression in psychopaths. So I don't think he was a psychopath. The second thing was he a sociopath? And the sociopath is more of the baked antisocial. It's the person who went through a ton of crap throughout their, they have some basic structures of empathy like normal people, but they just go towards criminal activities. Right. And the thing with him is, like, he had such a late life conversion to killing people. Right. So I don't think he kind of fit the sociopath either.
Right. And, I think one of the things that you mentioned was, this idea that for so many sociopaths and on a higher level psychopaths, there's this persistent element of, like, almost like lack of adrenaline, like adrenergic tone, like one of the classic triads we look for in a child, whether they're going to potentially express sociopathic traits later on in life, is the classic triad is like, are they fire starters? Do they harm animals? Are they wetting the bed at night? And the third one is interesting because the mechanism that controls, bedwetting is the alpha 1 receptors, the noradrenergic, the norepinephrine system. So the idea that, like, there's a correlation between, like, just like a general low level of, essentially fight or flight stress, like, you take someone like this, their pulse, like, while they're diffusing a bomb, and it's probably like in the 60s, in the 70s.
Yeah. That's in a lot of the early studies on how they identified psychopaths. They actually look for people with low reactivity to stress in their autonomic nervous system. So the next thing is, was Joker responsible for his actions? And, at this point, I believe he lacked the brain damage, developmental trauma, mental illness that would deny him the human capacity for choice, for moral choice. And most of his life, he operated in the law, right? And then he had this kind of conversion to the darker thoughts of his mind.
Yeah, and it was if you think about things as a result of, as psychiatrists, we think of things in a biopsychosocial model. And so what this movie is depicting, I think, is like kind of like a Swiss cheese situation where all three of those elements came to, like, from a biological perspective, he wasn't able to get his meds. From a psychological perspective, he's like learning more about his like past childhood trauma. From a social perspective, he's not getting the social support. So all these things line up in like kind of a perfect storm for this conversion that we witness through over the course of the movie.
Yeah. So I think that every human has the capacity to do malevolent acts. Everyone has the capacity to violate the rights and humanity of other people. Right. And it's something that some people wrestle with that face to face. They wrestle with their shadow, as Jung called it, where they come face to face with their capacity to do great evil. And other people literally are just, they shove it into their unconscious and never come face to face with it. And it may come out more impulsively, and they may be almost surprised, right? I think for a long time, we were, a part of a tribe of maybe 50 people, and you would see those same 50 people every day. And so, this movie depicts a man who could go through a world where he would never see the same people over and over again.
Right.
So he has no tribe. He's like taken out of his tribe, and he's an isolated person, which would certainly mean death back in the time when people lived in tribes. So I think his violence had more to do with his narrative, his the belief about his life and how other people have violated him. It wasn't in a traditional mass murder sense. Like each person he killed, there was a specific reason. Right. Whereas like a lot of the mass murders that are going on in the U.S., it's like irrational killing of many, many people.
Right. It's indiscriminate. And like the contrast that I would like draw to is like for example, the Joker that we see in the Christopher Nolan movies, played by Heath Ledger, classic psychopath, and so in my kind of headcanon, what I envision is that, eventually Arthur Fleck, Joaquin Phoenix Joker, was eventually taken in, locked up in Arkham Asylum for, kind of inciting this like kind of mass violence. And then this younger guy who, the implication is that, Heath Ledger's Joker went through like some like military trauma. And so the idea is that, you think of this young guy who like sees this like figure like come through who like incited this like whole movement. And so then when he ends up getting out of Arkham, like that's what he ends up wanting to like carry through as a legacy. And then he does end up doing more indiscriminate kind of mass murder type actions and stunts that are very showy and very Machiavellian and deliberate. So that's kind of my headcanon as to how one reconciles those two versions of the character.
Yeah, and I think he's not this film, but the Dark Knight. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes,
he's much more the classic psychopath.
Yep.
And the dark triad, the narcissist, psychopathy, and the Machiavellian. I think a lot
and
of...
we don't even talk about Jared Leto's Joker, so...
So every person he killed was sort of in this narrative of like, I don't feel attention.
Right.
I don't feel heard or understood. And after he killed the 3 men in the subway, he says, people finally see me. I'm not sure if I existed.
Yeah.
But people are starting to notice, and it's, you never listen to me. So he's telling his social worker these things. And it's this picture of, here's a guy who is deeply desiring to feel important, to feel connected to other people. And he's feeling some sense of empathy from the masses. So I think there's a theme of attention and just the primary, there's a primary, I would say, human drive of attention. The infant desires attention from the mother.
Attention and validation, like he was seeking the validation of just existing. And so going back to like the idea that I kind of mentioned earlier about, how we have a tendency to want to try to rationalize irrational actions. The movie sets up a narrative where, to some degree, you can lull yourself into rationalizing, his murders, versus, again, just to contrast something like the Joker. There's no rationalization there. It's pure chaos. It's pure madness.
Right. Yeah. So he gets this sort of attention, and then it becomes like a positive feedback towards more violence, you know? And so the next thing is that this movie is really resonating with the larger cultural narratives going on and experiences in our time. So, for example, mass shootings. You know, this is really unique to our time, our attention. We have a huge amount of attention on mass shootings, although mass shootings cause a very, very small amount of deaths. Like the amount of deaths caused by like something like fentanyl is so massively higher, or suicides, it's so massively higher. But we've created a huge amount of attention, because they're scary.
Right. Well, and part of that that contributes to that is just the senseless idea of how random it is. You know, I think for many it's easy to justify or again rationalize you know, something like the fentanyl epidemic as you know, even though this is very simplistic, like, well, it's still that person's choice to do this to themselves, or something like obesity or smoking. Like these are things that, yes, like cause lots more deaths kind of annually in the U.S. than what mass shootings cause. But what's become so culturally like significant about like the nature of a mass shooting is taking away that essence of choice, like from the people who end up being victims of it. And I think that's why it ends up being really scary and like really just kind of you know, something that like gets talked about like on a more larger scale, because, you know, I don't want to like be chosen to be shot, you know, just like going about my business in a mall or anything.
Yep. And I think imagine you're watching this and you feel hidden. You feel a ghost in our society. You feel without access to connection or empathy. You feel there's this deep underlying rage at maybe malevolent traumas that have been done to you by other human beings. You know, malevolent as in like someone like did this act against you to wrong you in some way. And so, you know, this movie is resonating with people like that at a very deep level. And some people, you know, are feeling this incredible rate of loneliness. Like statistically, loneliness has gone up quite a bit just in the last 10 years for high school seniors. The amount of people connected, you know, in actual meaningful events where they like are with other people has decreased while social media has increased. And social media, actually only 4% of the time are you actually like DMing some other human being. So most of social media is like entertainment and scrolling and like looking at other people. And these people that you're looking at are often, they're not real people. They're like, this is the best shot. We put candy in our kids' mouths. We got them to smile. And this is the one shot of the year that we're going to share. And,
the 50 other photos that we had to take to get to this point.
And some, you know, are heavily photoshopped, like of famous people, like a lot of the famous people heavily Photoshop their photos into a place where like we now idealize something that doesn't even exist.
And we all end up just kind of intrinsically feeding into each other's insecurities. You know, I'm sure those, even a famous celebrity who is, you know, they have Instagram feeds, they have Facebook feeds, and they scroll through, and, you know, what's it like for, you know, even someone like, you know, someone like Leonardo DiCaprio to see that Brad Pitt still looks amazing at his age, you know, like, you know, that's got to have some even just intrinsic, you know, effect on their own personal psyches and personal narratives that they craft for themselves.
Yeah. And envy, right? Envy is, you know, envy, resentment, loneliness are at, I would say, an all-time high, despite the gifts that technology has given us. So one of the things that I observe is that our needs, like some of the basic drives that we have as humans are met by things that are more and more distant from the actual things that they were made for. For example, sexual needs are met by porn, hunting needs are met by violent video games and shows, connection needs are met by social media, whereas only like 4% is actually like connection. And then you have, things that are on the decline, like, religious activities.
Right.
In the last 10 years, there's been like a 10% drop. And like a lot of people are just nothings. And that was in a recent Gallup poll. And so you have this like shift towards activities that might have given connection in a systematic way. And you have a movement away from that into like more like just isolative sort of activities.
So you're talking about a drop in just like participation in like just something like a social gathering, like that would in particular of like that would stem from a religious like going to church on a weekly basis.
There's this one paper in particular we reviewed in the in my social media episode, and it was like it showed the negative correlation of like out of person interactions like social media, and then it showed the positive health benefits of in-person interactions like sports and like religious activities. And so one of the things that we're seeing a shift away from some of those more bonding activities where you would do it with a group. And so I'm seeing a trend.
Right.
And then I'm seeing this movie come up where it's like you have an incredibly lonely, isolated person who doesn't have community. And I think about like all the ways that people used to get community and connection. And so you have people who are literally watching this 10 to 14 times.
Yeah.
And they're resonating with that loneliness. There was one guy who said online, he said at the end of the movie, I really thought he was a hero. And he is, just not in the conventional way. He is the hero of the misunderstood, the forgotten, the oppressed by society. He's like the hero of the villains that were born just because of society being itself, an artificial sector that benefits the normal ones and condemns the different ones. As a person who's been suffering of severe depression for many years, I really understood this.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting to me because, as I referenced earlier a podcast that I was listening to that I felt misunderstood kind of the mental illness aspect of what the film is demonstrating, but at the same time, I recognize that the vast majority of people who are going to be watching this are going to be people who come from the same background as far as the podcasters that I was listening to as far as training in mental health. They're we are going to be seeing a lot of nuance that plays into kind of the psychiatric element of it. But for the vast majority of people, it is a question of what is the kind of message that they're going to perceive and that is going to be perpetuated for themselves. So I think that that's an important aspect to keep in mind, especially as we maybe see. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Here's another quote. I'm so glad I didn't kill myself before seeing this movie. I would have missed out big time. Nothing else in life has compared.
Wow. That is a statement.
Here's another quote. About to go for my ninth time. Obviously, I think it's groundbreaking, a masterpiece, and I'm so happy to be alive. It means a lot to me, more than I could say. It's like having part of me repressed on represented on the big screen. And I never expected that ever. Read this last one for us.
That is a statement, yeah. Hell yeah. I love these comments. I feel the exact same way. I'm going for a 14th time next week. I feel so privileged we get to be alive and see this masterpiece in theaters.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I think if this film resonated with you and you're listening to this, and obviously if you're listening to this, you might have been resonating with this film and searching out more content to learn more about it.
Especially if you've stuck with us for this long.
Yeah. Realize that this is actually how many of my patients feel.
Yeah.
When they first come in to see me as a psychiatrist and as a therapist, I've had a number of people who have been incredibly disconnected, lonely, isolated. I had one patient in particular, he was literally living by himself for years. And, but I want you to know that it didn't stop there.
Yeah.
Right. So through therapy, we look at how to change like the narrative, the narratives. We work through some of the traumas as well in the past. And, if there is psychiatric illness, then we try to get on the medications that will like help bring them out of the suffering that they're in. And so, could the Joker have been met at certain points? I think he could have been. I think he could have been met. I think he could have been connected with. I think maybe when the Joker said something like, I am only understood, known, talked about, idealized, loved if I kill people.
Right. And I think that it's important to realize that at the end of the day, this is a piece of art. And like so many pieces of art that came before it, there's nothing inherent about the piece of art itself that is making you or compelling you to do something, or that is producing a product in society. Ultimately, it becomes about how you end up interpreting and perceiving it, and what you do with that perception that you take in for yourself.
Absolutely. And kind of coming back to like the history of mass shooting in America, I've been reading the Violence Project. They have some really good data. They've studied all mass shooters since 1966, and they found 4 commonalities. Number 1, a history of childhood abuse, either neglect, sexual abuse, physical abuse, viewing domestic violence, severely bullied, which leads to depression, anxiety, suicidality. Number 2, there's an identifiable crisis point in the weeks or months leading up to the shooting. For example, a change in job status, relationship rejections, relationship loss, with often some sort of communication regarding suicidal or homicidal thoughts. So they're communicating this with outsiders. They're putting out like things like, I need help. And then number 3, they're in most studied past shooters, they're looking for some sort of validation of their motivation. So they're hoping to also be famous, to be met with fascination, and there's this sort of social contagion that occurs. So there's groupings of the shootings that actually occur one after another. And this is really important for how we report actual mass shootings, right? Do we actually say their name? Do we tell their story? Do we show their journals? Do we show that to everyone over and over and over again? And then 4, they all have a way to do the plan. They have a place and a firearm. And interestingly, they found that 80% of weapons come from family members. So, how easy is it to buy a safe? If you're a dad or you're a mom, you're listening to this, you have guns, buy a safe, lock up those guns, Yeah,
and the evidence is strong that even just the, sheer presence of a firearm in the home elevates the risk of suicide and homicide. And so, like, where a lot of these mass shooters ended up intersecting kind of with, at this crisis point in their lives, once they were able to have the intent to murder and to commit this heinous crime, then just kind of became a matter of putting the puzzle pieces in place.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
So as someone who's watching this as a therapist and as a psychiatrist, like, I wish that there were intervention points for this person, right? I wish that this guy was captured not like when he's like 30 or in 40, I don't know how old he was, when he's living with his mom and he doesn't have a job, but like somewhere in high school, somewhere in junior high, somewhere even earlier than that, like grade school even. Could this person have been met with people who cared about him and who could give him empathy and compassion, who could, helped him understand and process through some of the difficult things in his life, and then also help him understand his anger. Yeah. Because he had an anger about being isolated and alone. He had an anger, and anger is there to overcome obstacles. Right. And I don't think the murder allowed him to actually overcome the obstacles. Right. It didn't allow him to actually gain meaningful connection.
And especially like, thinking about how, even just like the statement, like you're on 6 medications, how are they not helping? I see so often that it's especially like in someone like this, a patient like this, like it's very enticing and tempting to chase down the big flashy symptoms like the delusions, the hallucinations and whatnot, and miss something as fundamental as the chronic depression and what could be feeding that, and what is another element that could be being addressed. And I could see, in a society like Gotham where, I imagine, psychiatrist office are overbooked. They don't, these clinics probably don't get funding. They gotta like be in and out, like, in like, a 10-15 minute visit. Like I can imagine him growing up in a situation where the care just wasn't there and the environment just wasn't there to be able to provide like what he probably fundamentally needed at the basis of all this, in addition to his medications, in addition to social support.
Yeah. He fundamentally needed connection. And this is where I think if you're in the general public and you're listening to this, we have things called partial programs, like day treatment programs, and you go there 5 days a week, 7-8 hours a day, and you're in group psychotherapy. You're learning different coping skills, and you're connected to a therapist in a really deep and meaningful way. And I've seen patients like the Joker, go through the psychiatric hospital, get on some meds, get into partial. And sometimes, it takes longer than just a couple months, right? Sometimes it's like back and forth for 6 or 8 months. For like, if someone's been through severe childhood trauma, it may take a couple years, maybe after the partial individual psychotherapy for weeks and weeks and weeks, but it's like, there's progress. And, I've had patients who have been homeless and now they're starting to move towards their goals. It's easier to just blow the building up or burn the building down, right? It's harder to make small steps towards actually achieving meaningful progress. Like working through trauma is like tough.
Right.
It's tough because to work through trauma, you're going to have to remember the trauma.
And I feel so especially blessed at the institution that we work at, that we are actually able to, even within the model or the structure of partial hospitalization programs, have a specific group where people who might have been from like a similar functional status as the Joker, Arthur Fleck, are able to work together in being able to kind of work on those skills of, being able to function as a member of society, being able to have empathy and connect with others. I hear a lot about other partial hospitalization programs where kind of everyone's in kind of the same group together. So I think that there's a real like added element of like, just the sheer act of being able to like see that you are not alone. That can be so powerful. Even for someone as, as sick as, even as Arthur.
Yeah. And I want to reemphasize that we're not saying this to take away his moral choice for murder, right? But what we're saying is that there's like kindling in the fire that we actually have skillful ways of helping people. And we have a heart to help people. And like people in mental health, I think really do want to help people not progress to a place of being suicidal or not progress to place of being homicidal. So this is a guy, who slipped through the cracks, who all of those sort of things aligned, where he was given the gun and given the resources and, had that sort of the sequence of events that led him to create these acts of violence. And I think underneath that is a larger cultural story that's going on in, I would say, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of men and women, where they're just incredibly lonely and disconnected. And they feel as if all of their attempts of connection have been thwarted.
Yeah, no, it's I think in the right ways, in certain lights, I think that the metaphors of this film can serve as a little bit of a mirror to not necessarily the narrative, I think, of, society has failed you and, you're all alone in this, but rather like this is an epidemic of loneliness, like what you're saying. And so many others are in the same boat as you, desiring for that connection, desiring for that empathy.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Hans, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
I think we'll leave it for there.
Yeah.
If you're still listening, thank you.
I would like to humbly submit this episode for consideration for an Academy Award or for a Grammy if you're just listening to the audio version, or for an Emmy if this ends up being on TV.
You need to know how much that would mean to Hans.
Oh, you have no idea. I've already practiced my acceptance speech. So,
and if you're listening to this and you're like, I would really like Hans on my podcast, or I think he would be a great star in this movie I'm making, I'm sure you'd be open to that.
Yeah, no.
We're really hoping to launch your career here.
Yeah, thank you. Just let your people call my people.
That would be great. We'll do that. All right,
Thank you
we'll
so
leave it
much.
there.
Thank you.